The lamps in the wolfshans flickered with a dull yellow that made the war maps on the long oak table look older than they were. December air seeped through the cracks of the reinforced concrete walls, carrying with it the smell of wet pine and cold iron. Adolf Hitler sat stiff, backed in his chair, dressed in the familiar field, gray tunic, though his shoulders sagged with a fatigue that he refused to show. A tray of untouched tea sat beside him, already cooling. Across the room, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel was pacing slowly, as if trying to soften the weight of the message he had to deliver. General Zeitzler stood beside him, his jaw locked so tightly that a pulse beat angrily beneath his ear. Between them on the table was the report, heavy, grim, and final. Hitler did not look up when they entered. He stared instead at the Eastern Front map, his finger tracing the line where the Volga cut through Stalingrad. Bombs had broken the city into splinters months ago, but he still envisioned it as a prize he could hold. Mein Führer, Keitel began with a voice that sounded as if it had been buried under snow. We have word from Paulus. Hitler's finger froze on the map. Word, he said without turning, or excuses. Zeitzler swallowed hard. Permission to speak plainly, my Führer. No, Hitler said. And then, after a moment, yes, speak. Stalingrad is lost. The words seemed to fall onto the table like stones dropped into deep water. A quiet thud, then silence, then ripples no one could stop. Hitler slowly lifted his eyes from the map. Impossible. Keitel exchanged a glance with Zeitzler, but neither spoke. You heard me. Hitler said, impossible. Zeitzler opened the report with trembling fingers and laid it before Hitler. The Sixth Army is surrounded. Ammunition is nearly gone. The men are starving, freezing, and outnumbered. Supplies are not getting through. Paulus reports that further resistance without relief is futile. Hitler's jaw clenched. The skin around his eyes tightened until the whites almost vanished. Futile, he repeated in a whisper. Has he forgotten who he serves? Keitel stepped forward, voice low. He requests permission to attempt a breakout. At that, Hitler snapped upright. No. Mein Führer, no. Hitler slammed his palm down, rattling the teacup on the tray. There will be no retreat, no surrender, no withdrawal. Stalingrad must be held. Zeitzler closed his eyes for a moment, mastering himself before speaking again. With respect, my Führer, I, NDP, N-E-N-T not be held, S-E-N-S-E-E of I, T-C-L-E-R sult from S-T-O-O-D, Aunt des, in B-R-U-P-T-L bong, Y time, pacing to the far wall and back. His boots clicked sharply, echoing through the bunker like the ticking of a metronome counting down a tragedy. He stopped before the map again, staring at the red Soviet arrows encircling the Sixth Army. When I commanded the men in the Great War, Hitler said softly, no one spoke of impossibilities. We held lines 10 times worse than this. We endured. Zeitzler did not interrupt, though his face tightened. Hitler turned sharply. Paulus is to stand fast. He is to fight to the last man if necessary. The army must show the world the resolve of the Reich. Keitel hesitated. Mein Führer, he is asking for guidance. Hitler's voice turned cold. Tell Paulus this. Stalingrad will be held. No step backward. No thought of surrender. The Volga is the line that must never be crossed. Zeitzler felt his stomach twist. He had brought terrible news before, but never one that demanded such a denial of reality. The men will die, he said quietly. They will die heroes. Hitler answered. The bunker seemed to shrink with those words. A deep stillness fell over the room, as if even the concrete walls were listening. Zeitzler stepped forward, gathering courage. Mein Führer, allow me to speak freely. Our supply situation is catastrophic. The Luftwaffe cannot deliver what is needed. Goering promises what he cannot provide. General Paulus does not want surrender. He wants the ability to save his men. Hitler's eyes narrowed. Save, if they abandon their position, they save nothing. They betray the Reich. Kädel rubbed his brow, his voice a cracked whisper. My Führer, the army is finished unless what? Hitler snapped. Unless we bow to the enemy, unless we crawl away from the Volga like beaten dogs. No, Stalingrad is more than a city. It is a symbol of our will, and I will not allow that symbol to fall. The words chilled the room, but not because of their conviction. They were the words of a man clinging to something far removed from reality, like a drowning man clutching a stone. Zeitzler gathered the second report, far worse than the first. There is more, Mein Führer. Hitler did not respond. The Sixth Army reports cases of frostbite in the thousands. Men are eating horses, dogs even leather belts. Medical supplies are gone. Ammunition will not last the week. Hitler placed both hands on the table and leaned over the map. Tell Paulus to hold. The relief army will break through. Zeitzler's voice dropped. The relief army is too weak. The Soviets have massed overwhelming forces. They will not break through. Hitler straightened slowly, turned, and looked directly into Zeitzler's eyes. You believe we will lose Stalingrad. Zeitzler did not flinch. I know we will. Then you know nothing. Hitler said. The silence lingered, thick and painful. Finally, Kädel spoke again, his voice trembling. Mein Führer, what should I tell Paulus? Hitler's response came after a long moment, a moment during which he seemed to fold inward, crushed by something he refused to name. Tell him Stalingrad must hold. Tell him victory demands sacrifice. Tell him the eyes of the world are upon him. Zeitzler felt the finality in those words. There would be no reasoning with Hitler tonight. No argument would move him. He had sealed the fate of 200,000 men with a sentence spoken more for himself than for them. As the two generals left the room, the door shut softly behind them, and Hitler remained alone with the maps. The silence, and a destiny he refused to admit, was slipping away. The crackling of the stove was the only sound left. Hitler stared at Stalingrad as if the city itself had betrayed him. The night deepened outside the Wolfschans, and snow fell in slow, drifting curtains that softened even the sharp lines of barbed wire. Inside the bunker's hallway, Kädel and Zeitzler walked in heavy silence, their boots echoing as though each step carried the weight of thousands of men. A draft followed them, cold enough to seep through their greatcoats, but neither felt it. Their minds were far from the corridor. They were back in the ruins of Stalingrad, imagining men freezing in the shattered husks of buildings, while their Führer refused to see reason. Outside Hitler's door, Zeitzler stopped and rubbed his temples. He's living in another world, he said quietly. Kädel sighed deeply. He is living in a world he built for himself, and like all men who build their own world, he cannot bear to watch it collapse. Zeitzler didn't respond. He stared at the floor for a long moment, then finally murmured, 200,000 men, and he's using them to protect a symbol. Kädel nodded. He believes symbols win wars. They don't, Zeitzler said darkly. Men do, and men are dying in Stalingrad. Kädel opened his mouth, but whatever words he intended to speak faded. He only placed a hand on Zeitzler's shoulder before walking away. leaving the younger general standing alone in the hall with the bitter knowledge that the war was shifting beneath their feet. And, not for the better. Back inside the bunker's map room, Hitler remained alone for nearly an hour. The silence thickened around him, broken only by the faint crackle of the stove and the distant murmur of guards outside. He lifted the report again, but the words blurred. He rubbed his eyes with a trembling hand he didn't want anyone to see. Stalingrad lost. The thought made his stomach twist. He stared at a photograph clipped to the report, Paulus standing stiff and formal. A man Hitler had elevated and trusted. A man he believed possessed iron resolve. Now Paulus was asking to break out, to retreat. The word stung Hitler like a betrayal. Retreat! He dropped the paper on the table and stood, pacing again. His mind went backward not to his empire, but to the trenches of the Great War. He remembered the cold mud, the hunger, the rats that crawled over sleeping men. He remembered how his own commanders had seemed blind, how they gave orders from comfortable rooms miles away. And he remembered holding the line even when others fled. If he had endured those horrors, why couldn't Paulus? Why couldn't the Sixth Army? Why should any German soldier break before the enemy? A whisper of doubt crept into his thoughts, unwelcome, sharp, cold. Because times have changed. Because the Soviets are not the same enemy you once underestimated. Because your advisors are right and you are wrong. Hitler pushed the thoughts away violently. No, they were wrong. Paulus was wrong. Everyone was wrong except him. He stopped pacing and stared again at the map. Stalingrad glowed under the yellow lamp, a circle of red ink encircled by Soviet lines. A trap, a wound, a stain he refused to accept. A quiet knock came at the door. Hitler clenched his jaw. Enter. The door opened slowly, and General Jodl stepped inside. He looked exhausted, his eyes red from lack of sleep, but he saluted with practiced precision. Mein Führer, he murmured. You requested an update from the communications office. Hitler nodded without turning. Has there been any change? No, Mein Führer. The encirclement remains firm. Paulus is still requesting orders. Hitler inhaled sharply through his nose. And what does he say now? Jodl hesitated. He reports that Soviet forces have increased shelling. Casualties are severe. Supplies are at critical levels. He believes a breakout must begin immediately if any of the army is to survive. Hitler's hands curled into fists. Jodl added quietly, He asks for your permission. My permission. Hitler spat the word as if it were poison. Permission to retreat like cowards. Permission to save the army. Jodl answered, though his voice barely reached above a whisper. Hitler turned sharply, eyes burning. Save. If they retreat, we lose everything. The whole front collapses. Do you not understand that? Jodl bowed his head. I understand, Mein Führer, but the reality, Hitler cut in coldly, is that Paulus lacks faith. He must hold. He must show the world what German resolve means. Jodl swallowed, choosing silence over argument. Hitler stepped closer until he stood only a foot away. Tell me, Jodl, do you believe Stalingrad is lost? The question hung like ice in the air. Jodl took a long moment before replying. I believe, Mein Führer, that the men there have done all that men can do. It was not the answer Hitler wanted. He turned away again, gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles went white. His voice came slowly, each word hard, edged and deliberate. Then they will do more. Jodl lifted his head slightly. Mein Führer. Hitler cut him off. Tell Paulus this. The Sixth Army will stand fast. Surrender is forbidden. Fight to the last bullet. Jodel's face went pale. I will relay the message. He saluted, turned, and left the room with steps that sounded heavier than when he had entered. Meanwhile, winter swallowed Stalingrad in a storm of bitter snow and howling wind. The ruined city was a graveyard of broken chimneys, collapsed factories, frozen corpses, and tanks half buried in drifts. Men huddled in the shattered remains of buildings, their breath turning to frost in the air as they shivered uncontrollably. General Paulus stood near a window frame that no longer had glass, staring at the white emptiness beyond. He held Hitler's newest order in his hand. He read it again, though he already knew the words, "Stand fast. No surrender. Fight to the last bullet." Paulus lowered the paper slowly. His aide, Captain Schmidt, stood beside him, pale-faced and trembling. "What does he expect us to do?" Schmidt whispered. "Starve in this ruin, freeze, let our men die here." Paulus did not answer immediately. His eyes were drawn to the courtyard below, where a group of soldiers shared a small fire, one scarcely hotter than a candle flame. Their uniforms hung from them like rags. Their cheeks were sunken, their lips blue. Paulus finally spoke. "He expects us to hold, even if holding means dying." Schmidt shook his head. "It's madness." Paulus looked at him, the expression on his face a mixture of sorrow and resignation. "It is orders." He folded the paper and slipped it into his coat. The wind howled through the broken window, scattering snow across the floor. "What will you do, sir?" Schmidt asked. Paulus looked once more over the bleak ruins of Stalingrad, the final resting place of an army. "I will obey," he whispered, but in his heart he felt something break. Back in the Wolfschens, hours passed. Midnight approached, cold and colorless. Hitler remained awake, refusing rest. He stared at the map so long that the lines and arrows began to blur into strange shapes. Yet he refused to leave. He felt as though abandoning the map, even for a moment, was abandoning Stalingrad itself. Suddenly, the door creaked open again. A shadow stepped inside. It was Himmler, Mein Führer. He said, bowing deeply, "May I speak?" Hitler did not look at him. "If it is about Stalingrad, save your breath." Himmler moved closer. "I come only to assure you that loyalty remains strong among your men. They will follow you, Mein Führer, no matter how dark things may appear." Hitler stared at the red circle on the map. "They had better." Himmler's eyes gleamed behind his glasses. "No matter what the generals say, the will of the Führer is the will of Germany." Hitler said nothing, but for the first time that night, the tension in his jaw eased slightly. Himmler gave a thin smile. "Stalingrad is not lost, not while you believe it can be held." Hitler's voice rose like a low growl. "I do believe." "Then the army will stand," Himmler said smoothly. Hitler nodded slowly, almost to himself. "Stalingrad will hold." But far beneath the surface of his voice lay a tremor, one he refused to acknowledge.